Hello, welcome to another video. Here I'm going to be talking about why I'm not an atheist, and I'm going to start off by defining a lot of terms. First, I'm going to define atheism, which is simply a lack of belief in God. And then there's theism, which is a belief in a God, or belief in God. And then there's also agnosticism, which is the in-between. Someone who's agnostic does not know whether or not God exists, or thinks it's impossible to know if God exists, or thinks it's impossible to know which God exists, if there is a God. And within atheism, there are actually two types of atheism. There's strong atheism and weak atheism. You're a strong atheist if you will defend the claim that there is no God, if you believe that there is no God. And you are a weak atheist if you simply lack a belief in God, or you don't believe that God exists. And there is overlap between agnosticism and weak atheism because you both lack a belief in God. It's just for agnosticism, you'll say that you don't know, while for weak atheism, you'll say that you're not convinced that God exists, or that you don't believe in God. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about a burden of proof. Who has the burden of proof? Now, a common misconception is that the burden of proof is on whoever is trying to prove that something exists, but this is not the case. Rather, the burden of proof is on whoever is making any sort of claim. If you are positively claiming that God exists, or even positively claiming that God does not exist, then you are making a claim and you have a burden of proof. So theists and strong atheists have a burden of proof, while weak atheists and agnostics do not have a burden of proof because they simply lack belief. Now, that section was kind of irrelevant to most of the next part of the video, because what I'm going to be talking about next is just some reasons about why I'm not an atheist. First, I'm going to be talking about some very personal, individual reasons as to why I specifically am not an atheist, and then I'm going to be going into some responses to more popular arguments for atheism, and just talk about why I'm not convinced by them. First, why am I not an atheist? Very personal reasons. First, I have to mention that my default position, or starting point for my beliefs, is and always has been Christianity, because I was raised in the church ever since I was a wee lad, and I've always had pretty much positive experiences in the church and within Christian communities, and I recognize that I am very privileged in that respect. So I'm very grateful that I've had those positive experiences. But yes, this is the case. My default position is Christianity, and so I treat that as my starting point. If I were to be convinced of atheism, someone would have to convince me of that, while my starting point is still Christianity. So in some way, it's kind of like the burden of proof for me specifically is on atheism rather than Christianity, which is a very specific form of theism. Not intellectually, but just intuitively, because I can't control the fact that my intuitions lead me towards Christianity naturally, and I'm just not convinced by atheism and have not been convinced of it so far. Then another reason why I'm not an atheist is that there's something about the philosophy of atheism that I don't like, and that's how atheism highlights humanity. Specifically, a lot of atheist responses to very specific forms of theism, such as Christianity, involve putting humanity on a sort of podium above God, or putting humans above God. And I'll give some examples. Well, I'll give one example. Most atheist arguments tend to come in the format that, well, if God were to exist, we would expect this sort of thing to happen. And I think that entire line of reasoning, while fair as a form of argument because it's very persuasive and convincing, does not convince me. Because I think if God exists, we have no way of knowing what he would do. We cannot put ourselves above him in terms of morality, knowledge, strategy, anything like that. The main purpose of atheist arguments like that is to simply convince people that God does not exist, in my opinion. I don't think it's actually an effective form of argumentation, and I do not like the philosophy that backs it, because it seems to highlight humanity. And I think if God exists, then we cannot highlight humanity. And so those are the two main personal reasons why I'm not an atheist, because my starting point is Christianity, and I simply have not been convinced of atheism so far, and then I don't really like atheism's philosophy. But now I'm going to be going into some popular atheist stances and why I'm not convinced by those either. First is the problem of evil, which is probably the most popular and famous atheist argument. And I think the best version of it is the problem of suffering, which is essentially an internal critique of Christianity, saying that if God were to exist, we would not expect the amount of gratuitous suffering in the world that we observe around us. And in this version of the argument, atheists are not saying that suffering is inherently evil or has any sort of moral value. They're just saying that if the God described in the Bible or within Christianity or other religions were to exist, then we wouldn't expect suffering, because for some reason it's God's purpose to avoid suffering and to create more pleasure for humans, which, as you might get from my sarcastic tone, is a disagreement I have with the argument. I don't think that it's God's purpose to prevent suffering necessarily, because I also don't think that suffering has moral value even within Christianity. I think God's only purpose for the world, if God exists, is to bring value to himself, not to create certain amounts of pleasure and suffering for humans. I think pleasure and suffering are a means to create different experiences for humans, to develop them, and to eventually get humans to bring glory to God. I don't think that the amount of suffering in the world has anything to do with that ultimate purpose, which is why this argument is simply unconvincing to me in favor of atheism. The next argument that atheists will say is that God is unnecessary because of science. And unfortunately, I'm not very convinced by pragmatist arguments that say that because we don't need God as an explanation, he doesn't exist. Because that's not what that means. Even if science were to explain absolutely everything about the universe, which it doesn't, this would not mean that God does not exist. It would simply mean that we don't need him as an explanation, not that he doesn't exist. But additionally, I do not think that science is even close to explaining everything about the universe, because science is a field that is all about observation and explaining and describing and finding explanations for data and experiments and things that we observe in the world. So if there are things that we do not objectively observe, they're outside the realms of science, and trying to get science to answer those kinds of things is frivolous and in vain. So I'm going to try to bring up a few examples of things that I don't think science can tell us about. One example might be something like ancient history, going back to 2,000 or 4,000, 6,000, a million, billion, trillion years ago, because we aren't observing those right now. And while we might have evidence or artifacts from those times, we have no way of definitively saying what actually happened involving those pieces of evidence, because we simply can't know. And I don't think science can really tell us either. Next is maybe things like purpose or morality. We don't exactly observe those things objectively, and it's kind of insane to suggest that science could tell us what our purpose or what objective morality is. If there is objective morality in the first place, that's also a big question. But broadly, any sort of really philosophical questions that don't have to do with observations or data or things aren't really answerable by science, I think. One other thing I'll add is consciousness, which we might say is something we observe, but I don't think so, because consciousness is primarily subjective. It's defined by its subjectiveness, and so I don't think that science, which mainly seeks to explain objective, observable data, can really tell us anything about what the subjective experience of consciousness actually is. And so those are just a few examples. There are probably a lot more of things that science cannot explain. I think science is largely overrated, and so if you only rely on science to tell you everything about the world, then obviously you aren't going to think that anything exists outside of science. But I think it's really easy to demonstrate that there are things that science cannot answer just categorically. Not only that science has not answered yet, but that science is literally incapable of answering, because it does not have the tools for that. It is not the tool made for answering those kinds of questions. And the third statement that I'm going to be responding to is that there is not enough evidence for God. Or another version of this is that there is absolutely no evidence for God. The reason I'm not convinced when people say this is simply that I think the standard of evidence is extremely subjective. I think that essentially anything can be interpreted as evidence for anything. For example, the chair that I'm sitting on, the idea that I am sitting on a chair can be backed up by the evidence of my sense perceptions that I'm sitting on a chair. And flat earthers, people who believe in a flat earth, are convinced because of things they interpret as evidence for a flat earth. Even if we don't agree with their evidence, we can't deny that those are things that they are convinced by. And so similarly with Christianity, I think that the very fact that there are Christians who are convinced by certain things is evidence for the idea that there is evidence for Christianity, because anything can be interpreted as evidence for anything. We just all disagree on what constitutes as proper evidence. And we can argue about what evidence is good and bad and all that, but we're not going to agree because people have different views, and we cannot avoid that. So my point broadly with the idea that there is absolutely no evidence is that it's a very uneducated statement, because the mere existence of certain positions that you disagree with shows that there is at least some evidence for those positions, because people believe in them with reasons, and those reasons are evidence. And then with the statement that there is not enough evidence for God is again just super subjective. Whether or not something is enough evidence to convince you will depend on you and your own standard of evidence and what you personally are convinced by. And I personally am not convinced that there is no God, because again, my standard position is still Christianity. Even if intellectually that shouldn't be the case, I can't deny my intuitions. I'm just naturally led. You might say I'm biased towards Christianity, and so I'm just not convinced of atheism. And that was a very quick summary of my beliefs concerning atheism, why I don't really enjoy atheism, why I'm not convinced by a few of the biggest arguments for it. I can maybe make some more videos on those specific arguments if you want. And if you want to fight me on anything that I've said, which you may very well want to, you can comment in the comment section, or you can contact me directly. But I hope you enjoyed this quick little rant about atheism and why I don't really like it. Bye!